The sea was not calm that summer. It heaved and snarled like an animal, the wind shearing across its surface, foam bursting white over the black-green depths. From above, it looked empty. No ships, no markers, nothing but waves. Yet beneath those waters, something alive pulsed through the dark. A quiet rhythm steady as a heartbeat, a lifeline the enemy would never see. Across the channel, France burned. Tanks clawed through hedgerows thick as fortress walls, their treads grinding the mud of Normandy into history. Each advance burned gallons of fuel, each flamethrower, jeep, and aircraft devouring what Britain could barely send. Above the rumble of artillery, a single truth whispered through the command tents. Armies live on fuel, not food. Without it, even victory stalls. But here, under the waves, a new kind of war was being fought. Not by soldiers with rifles, but by engineers with spanners, oilmen with calculations, divers with lungs of iron. They worked in silence while others thundered across Europe. They built not to destroy, but to sustain, the invisible twin of invasion. The contrast was brutal. On land, chaos and fire. Under the sea, patience and pressure. In Normandy, destruction was measured in cities leveled. Here it was measured in leagues per mile. The men who fought this secret war could not speak of it. Their battlefield was made of salt water and time, their weapons of rubber, lead, and faith. Every coil of hose lowered from British docks carried risk. Each section, black and gleaming, was lowered like a vein into the deep. The channel was no ally. It shifted, crushed, and twisted the line like a living thing. Yet the engineers persisted, spooling out miles of fragile tubing as though threading a needle through the heart of Europe. Above them, the Luftwaffe still prowled. German U-boats still lurked. The pipeline was a whisper beneath their roar. One signal intercepted, one torpedo misplaced, and months of planning could vanish into oil-slicked foam. But no one found it. No one even guessed. In small huts along the coast, men watched dials tremble. Pressure gauges blinked faintly. Somewhere across the sea, the tanks of the Allied armies drank the results. The fuel that kept Patton's columns moving, that filled the wings of Spitfires, that lit the night sky over France. It all flowed from this unseen artery. History would record the thunder of Normandy, the bravery of soldiers storming beaches, the banners of liberation raised over Europe. Few would remember the hum under the sea, the quiet line that made it all possible. And so the waves rolled on, their secret buried just beneath the foam. No medals, no parades, just the pulse of fuel through darkness, a machine of rubber and pressure built by minds that refused to accept the impossible. What if the war's greatest supply line wasn't made of steel, but of silence? London, 1943. The war room smelled of smoke, sweat, and maps. Men hunched over tables littered with compasses, coffee cups, and casualty charts. Outside, the city's light stayed blacked out. But inside, another darkness gathered, one of numbers, logistics, the quiet arithmetic that decided who lived and who lost. Operation Overlord was taking shape. The invasion of Europe, the greatest amphibious gamble in history. But as the plans thickened with arrows and timetables, one question kept clawing its way back. How do you feed an army of machines across a hostile sea? Every tank, truck, and bomber was a hungry beast, its stomach full of gasoline. Eisenhower called fuel the lifeblood of modern war. Yet that lifeblood had no guaranteed artery. The Allies had the men, the weapons, the ships. What they lacked was distance and endurance. Fuel convoys could cross the channel, yes, but tankers were floating targets. One Luftwaffe bomb, one torpedo, and 1 million gallons would vanish into fire. Air transport? Impossible at scale. A single bomber could barely carry what a tank battalion would drink in an hour. Every method seemed to expose the same weakness, power without pulse. The room buzzed with voices. Commanders debated supply rates as if sheer volume could will them into existence. Charts of tonnage and flow rates replaced battle maps. For every mile of advance across France, the figures bled red, not from enemy bullets, but from math. That was the irony. The mightiest invasion fleet in history could flatten a coastline, but it could not promise fuel for its own armor once ashore. Every gallon had to cross beaches that would be shelled, mined, and cratered. Beachheads could feed men, perhaps even food and bullets, but gasoline, flammable, volatile, demanded something more constant, more protected. The Allied doctrine was clear. Mobility wins wars. But mobility without supply is illusion. Tanks without fuel are monuments. Engines without petrol are dead weight. We can't fight physics, muttered one engineer. Not unless we cheat. At the Petroleum Warfare Department, a cluster of warehouses and drafting rooms hidden behind London's facades, a new kind of soldier went to work. They weren't generals or tacticians. They were mathematicians, pipe fitters, and oilmen. Their orders were blunt, absurd even. Find a way to move fuel from England to France without the enemy seeing a thing. It sounded like fantasy. The channel was 40 miles wide and alive with storms. Any floating structure would be spotted and destroyed. Any tanker could be sunk. And yet, the impossible was not new to these men. They had already built flame projectors for beaches, petrol bombs for airfields, and decoy fires to mislead bombers. If there was a way to turn chemistry into camouflage, they would find it. Days bled into nights. Engineers ran calculations until their pencils broke. Some proposed underwater storage tanks. Others, floating fuel drums chained end to end. Each idea collapsed under its own weight or risk. Yet the conversation shifted from if to how. One sketch, just a loop of rubber drawn over a map, began to circulate. A pipe. Not on the surface, but under it. The thought hung in the air like static. Could a flexible hose stretch from England to France? Could fuel be pumped beneath the waves, safe from bombs and torpedoes? It was absurd. It was genius. Eisenhower's staff dismissed it as a plumber's dream. But somewhere deep in the PWD, someone smiled. The war had just handed engineers the one problem no general could solve, and they intended to cheat physics after all. Jeffrey William Lloyd was not a soldier, and he wore that fact like armor. His weapon was imagination, dangerous in wartime, but sometimes that's what a war demands. In 1943, as the invasion planning consumed generals and politicians, Lloyd sat in a cramped office at the Petroleum Warfare Department, a place that looked less like a ministry and more like a cluttered workshop. Blueprints littered every table. Coffee stains marked the corners of history. He was convinced the answer lay not in steel but in rubber, that strange elastic miracle of the industrial age. Rubber stretched, sealed, survived pressure. It could flex where metal broke. To most of Whitehall, the idea sounded eccentric, even absurd. But to Lloyd, it was clarity itself. If men can walk the seabed with mines, he said one afternoon, fuel can too. So began Operation PLUTO, the pipeline under the ocean. The code name itself sounded like mischief, almost whimsical. But beneath its humor was audacity. A cable of rubber and lead stretching across the English Channel, carrying petrol straight into France. No tankers, no convoys, no visible trace. Just pressure, mathematics, and faith in engineering. Lloyd gathered a strange fellowship. Oil engineers who understood viscosity like poets understood rhythm. Mathematicians who dreamed in equations. Submarine designers used to the tyranny of pressure. Together they studied currents, seabed contours, the physics of drag. They argued, they mocked one another, and then when no one was watching, they worked through the night. Not everyone believed. Naval officers scoffed openly. A hosepipe across the channel. One snorted. You'll fuel the fishes before you fuel France. Admiralty doctrine demanded reliability, not invention. War was no place for what one colonel called a plumber's utopia. Yet Lloyd pressed on. He knew the quiet truth that innovation always offends tradition, until it wins. Their first trials were crude. At the PWD's testing grounds in the English countryside, rubber pipes burst under pressure. Valves screamed, oil splattered, engineers cursed and started again. Each failure taught them something. How to brace joints, how to calculate pressure loss over distance, how to coil and uncoil miles of line without tearing it apart. Sleep was optional. Persistence wasn't. Lloyd's team became a small army of insomnia and invention. They took lessons from telegraph cables, from diving bells, from shipbuilders who knew how metal bent under waves. Piece by piece, a vision formed. Not a single pipe, but two competing designs. One flexible and light like a hose, the other rigid and strong like a spine. The rivalry between them would come to define the project's next chapter. For now, Lloyd only smiled at the madness of it all. Beneath the laughter and failure, he sensed something electric, that fine line where impossibility starts to bend. The idea was mad, yes, but then again, so was trying to defeat an empire with hoses and hope. By winter of 1943, the dream had split in two. What began as a single idea, a hose across the sea, had become a rivalry as fierce as any fought on the front lines. Two designs, two philosophies, two answers to the same impossible question. The Hayes cable, supple, ingenious, built on the logic of telegraph lines and the delicate language of pressure. And the Hameline pipe, rigid, steel-boned, traditional, a soldier's kind of certainty. The Hayes team believed in flexibility. Their pipeline was a lead-lined hose wrapped in layers of steel tape and canvas, designed to move with the sea rather than resist it. It could be spooled like cable, unrolled from ships and laid across the channel in one seamless coil. Its patron saint was Lieutenant Commander Hartley, a quiet mathematician turned engineer who thought in terms of currents and resistance. His calculations whispered that movement could be safety, that a structure able to bend would survive what rigid strength could not. Across the courtyard, the Hameline men worked in the language of steel. Their pipeline was built from welded segments, each 20-foot length of pipe locked to the next like the spine of a serpent. It was heavier, clumsier, but it promised durability and familiarity. The Navy liked it. You could see it, measure it, bolt it down. For them, the flexible hose felt like heresy, a theory, not a weapon. The contrast was absolute. Mathematics versus metallurgy, elasticity versus endurance. And beneath the rivalry ran something deeper, fear. Whichever design failed would take its creators' reputations with it. Tests began along Britain's southern coast. The beaches of the Isle of Wight became a theater of secrecy. At dawn, cranes lowered coils of pipe into the surf. Engineers in oilskins shouted over the wind, their breath fogging in the cold. Pumps coughed to life, gauges trembled, and then, with a low groan, the first trials began. The sea fought back. Joints split under pressure. Valves burst like gunfire. Miles of precious tubing tore apart and vanished beneath waves. Each failure brought more doubters. "The channel will eat your pipe by breakfast," muttered one admiral. "You're building a myth, not a machine." But the men of Pluto refused to yield. They tested again and again, adjusting the pressure ratios, refining the real mechanisms that would unwind the hose from a rotating drum. They called the massive steel reels conundrums because no one could look at them without frowning. Night after night, they watched oil bleed into the sea, then patched, welded, recalculated, and tried once more. Secrecy cloaked everything. Locals who saw black hoses slithering into the surf were told it was underwater telephone work. No one asked twice. By spring, one design began to pull ahead. The Hayes cable, with its supple body and smooth deployment, began to survive where the Hameline snapped. Engineers on the testing vessel. Holdfast watched with disbelief as fuel pressure held steady through 30 miles of submerged line. The pumps roared, the dials leveled, and for the first time, petrol flowed freely under the sea. They had done it. The impossible had become ordinary. Gallons of fuel traveling beneath the waves, untouched by storm or enemy. The men on deck didn't cheer. They just stood in the wind, grinning like thieves in the dark. No telegram, no announcement, no photograph. It was the purest kind of victory. Silent, invisible, and utterly vital. In the codebook of secrecy, this success would earn no line. But for the engineers of Pluto, it meant one thing. The war could now move faster than fear. June 1944. The sky over Normandy is a storm of smoke and wings. Paratroopers fall through tracer fire, ships hammer the coast, and the beaches of France become a theater of thunder. Every photograph, every headline captures the visible war, the roar of liberation. But beneath that noise, far from cameras and glory, another front awakens in silence. From the deck of HMS Latimer, the sea looks endless, indifferent. Wind lashes the cables coiled on the deck, each one thick as a man's arm, slick with salt and oil. Below decks, gauges tremble under the weight of pressure. On board, a handful of men work without fanfare. Engineers, divers, and pipe fitters. Their war measured not in miles conquered, but in miles laid. They are the keepers of Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, now being born into the chaos above. The operation begins at dawn. The first drum, a conundrum, creaks to life, spinning its massive coils into the channel. The hose slips into the gray water, vanishing almost instantly beneath the chop. To an untrained eye, it looks fragile, ridiculous even. But this is no garden hose. It's a lifeline, a vein of pressure and promise. Each rotation of the reel is a risk, every mile a bet against physics. The channel does not surrender easily. Currents tear at the pipe's body, dragging it into jagged rocks. Saltwater seeps through microscopic fissures, threatening to burst the line before it even connects. Divers descend into darkness colder than death, groping along the seabed with gloved hands, searching for leaks they cannot see. "We were at war with the sea," one later said. "It hit harder than any German shell." Up top, the men fight a different battle, against time and silence. The fleet around them thunders toward France, yet they must move invisibly. No radio chatter, no lights. German radar still scans the horizon. One flare, one glimpse of this strange coiling machinery, and months of work could vanish beneath the waves. Hours stretch into days. Storms roll in, each one threatening to tear the new artery apart. The men watch the dials like priests at prayer, waiting for a sign that pressure holds. When a gauge needle steadies, they breathe again. When it wavers, they start over. Somewhere on the far shore, Allied tanks rumble forward, unaware that the lifeblood they depend on is crawling toward them beneath the surf. By midsummer, the first line reaches France. A cheer echoes through the Latimer's hull, small and private. No medals, no headlines, just a brief exhale of triumph. Above them, bombers fly toward Berlin. Below, the pipeline hums, silent, tireless, defiant. The world would remember D-Day for its beaches and its bravery. But in the deep, where sunlight fades and pressure crushes steel, another kind of courage held the line. The war was being won, not just with bullets, but with torque and rubber, courage and calculation. The night was still when the gauges began to fall. One moment, the pressure was perfect, smooth, constant, steady. The next, it plummeted. A sharp hiss rose through the hull, faint at first, then unmistakable. Somewhere beneath 20 miles of black water, the pipeline had ruptured. The engineers froze. For weeks, Pluto had held strong, defying storms and skepticism alike. Now, as Allied armor advanced on Caen, the invisible artery that fed it had begun to bleed. On the deck of HMS Latimer, the smell of fuel hung heavy. In the moonlight, slick ribbons of petrol glimmered on the waves, fragile, shimmering, incriminating. If the Germans saw it, if even one patrol plane caught the reflection, the secret would die that night. Orders snapped across the deck. Pumps shut down. Pressure was vented, meters recalibrated, maps spread across tables wet with sea spray. Somewhere down there in the dark, cold miles between Britain and France, a joint had given way. A weak seam, a crushed coupling, maybe a rock puncture. It didn't matter why. What mattered was the silence that followed. Retreat was the safe choice. The Navy urged it. "We'll lose more fuel than we'll save," one officer warned, but the engineers refused. They'd come too far to abandon their creation to the sea. "We built it to survive," one muttered, gripping his wrench like a weapon. "Now we prove it." Under blackout conditions, divers descended. No lights, no sound, just touch and instinct. They moved through the freezing dark, guided by memory and the faint vibration of escaping fuel. Each second stretched into eternity. Above, the crew waited, breath held, watching the dials for life. Hours passed. The sea pressed down like a fist. Then a tremor, a low thud, a signal from below. The rupture was sealed. Pumps restarted. Pressure climbed. At first, the line groaned, uncertain. Then it steadied. By dawn, the channel was calm again, the fuel flowing once more, in the unseen, unstoppable. The engineers stood in silence, faces gray with exhaustion, eyes fixed on the humming gauges. The war would move forward that day. Caen would burn and tanks would roll, powered by a pipeline that had bled and lived. By late summer of 1944, the impossible had become ordinary. From the quiet pumps of the Isle of Wight to the battered docks of Cherbourg, fuel now flowed in an unbroken stream. 1 million gallons a day, a river beneath the sea. The channel, once a barrier of fear and storm, had been turned into a bridge of pressure and patience. Every hour, every heartbeat of machinery carried the war forward. The numbers were staggering. From the pumping stations disguised as seaside cottages, great pistons thumped without rest, pushing aviation fuel and petrol through the coiled arteries of Pluto. What began as a single line now sprawled into a network, one to Cherbourg, another soon to Boulogne, branching like veins across Europe's wounded body. On paper, it was logistics. In reality, it was power. The Allies were on the move. Patton's Third Army surged across France, devouring miles at a pace the Germans could not comprehend. To the enemy, it seemed supernatural, a force that never stalled, never slowed. But behind every roaring Sherman and every low-flying thunderbolt was a calculation, a pipe, a pressure gauge holding steady beneath the waves. The doctrine of mobility had found its weapon. German intelligence was baffled. Reports spoke of vast Allied fuel dumps hidden in forests, phantom tankers appearing at night, secret supply trains running under camouflage nets. They searched fields, bombed crossroads, interrogated prisoners, but no one could explain the truth. The source of Allied endurance lay not on land, but under the sea, humming softly in the dark. At the Petroleum Warfare Department, engineers watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. Their creation, born in laughter, doubt, and failure, now dictated the rhythm of liberation. Yet they could tell no one. Every success was classified, every triumph buried under the seal of secrecy. Men worked 36-hour shifts, sleeping beside humming pumps, their dreams filled with the pulse of pressure lines. Some went home smelling of fuel, their hands scarred and blackened from valve grease. They knew that while others fought for glory, their war was fought with flow rates and tolerances. In Cherbourg, where the pipeline surfaced, soldiers guarded the pumping station with rifles. The place looked ordinary, a few sheds, a small dock, nothing worth bombing. But within its walls, gauges gleamed like instruments of prophecy. The first trickle of fuel there had been met with disbelief, and then awe. One officer whispered, "It's like magic." Another corrected him. "No, it's mathematics." As the armies advanced eastward, the pressure increased. Each new mile meant more demand, more strain on the pumps, more sleepless nights for the engineers who kept the invisible tide flowing. The sound of the machinery became a kind of music, low, constant, hypnotic. It was the sound of progress, of persistence, a song only a handful of men would ever hear, though millions marched to its rhythm. And yet amid the triumph, there was exhaustion. Men collapsed at their posts, faces gray from fumes and fatigue. Still they rose again, knowing that the flow could not stop. To pause was to choke the advance. To fail was to undo the invasion itself. The war in France moved like a storm. Cities fell, bridges shattered, and across it all the secret river beneath the sea ran steady, unseen, undefeated. No medal would bear its name. No monument would mark its course. But through that dark artery flowed the lifeblood of victory. By the autumn of 1944, the tide of war had become a flood. The Allies were no longer clawing for beachheads. They were racing across a continent. Behind the front, in the quiet rhythm of pumps and gauges, the invisible hand of Pluto kept pace. From the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, from Cherbourg toward Antwerp, new lines unfurled like arteries through a living body. Fuel was no longer the limitation of strategy. It was its weapon. What had begun as a desperate improvisation now governed doctrine itself. The Allied command called it the logistical miracle. In the shadow of tanks and air squadrons, it was fuel that defined their reach, not bravery alone. Montgomery's words echoed through the briefings. Tactics win battles. Logistics win wars. The generals who once doubted the engineers now built their plans around them. Every advance, every armored thrust began first with a question of flow rates and delivery schedules. Across the channel, the engineers watched the pressure charts climb. 1 million gallons a day became 2. The pumping stations that once rattled like experiments now roared like engines of empire. New shore terminals appeared across liberated France. Boulogne, Calais, Dieppe, each connected by a growing web of steel and rubber. The men of Pluto had built not just a pipeline, but a philosophy. Adaptability as strategy, resilience as doctrine. The Germans could not match it. Their fuel lines lay captive to the rail, rigid, predictable, exposed. Allied bombers hunted them like predators. Every destroyed train, every broken bridge strangled the Wehrmacht a little more. Panzer divisions that once swept across Europe now sat idle, their engines silent, their crews scavenging for diesel from abandoned tractors. The Reich had built its armies on motion, but without fuel, it found only paralysis. In that contrast lay the true story of the war's end. Rigidity versus flexibility, control versus creativity. The Allies adapted faster than the enemy could react. Pluto was proof that ingenuity could outfight ideology, that a hose beneath the sea could strike harder than any bomb. As autumn deepened, The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The secret artery beneath the channel had turned mobility into inevitability. In planning rooms across Europe, maps of supply routes now bore the same reverence once reserved for battlefields. Years later, when NATO formed its modern doctrine, it would borrow the same lessons from speed, redundancy, adaptability. The quiet triumph of Pluto lived on in every convoy, every refueling strategy, every unseen calculation that kept armies alive. It had started as a wild experiment. It ended as destiny. By spring of 1945, Europe was breathing again. The guns were falling silent, cities rising from rubble, and armies that had marched on steel and courage were finally standing still. But through it all, the pipelines of Pluto still hummed softly beneath the channel, carrying the last trickles of fuel toward victory. The men who had built and maintained them kept their silence. Their war had never been one of noise. Even as the Allies celebrated liberation, the engineers of the Petroleum Warfare Department worked in shadows. Orders came down to dismantle sections of the line, recover what could be salvaged, and erase what could not. The pumping stations, disguised as seaside cottages and gasworks, were shuttered and sealed. A few still smelled faintly of oil, the scent of an invisible triumph. No medals were pinned, no announcements made. They were told simply, "Forget what you built." Most soldiers never knew. To them, the fuel had always been there. Drums appearing in depots, trucks filled by dawn, tanks fed like clockwork. They could not imagine that the lifeblood of their advance had flowed beneath their feet, silent as breath. Pluto remained a ghost, a secret artery hidden in plain sight. For nearly 2 decades, its story slept under classification. The photographs, the diagrams, the reports, all locked away. Engineers who had fought their own war with pressure gauges and wrenches grew old without speaking of it. A few would meet quietly, trading memories in pubs by the sea, their laughter tinged with pride and disbelief. "They'll never believe it," one said, shaking his head. And maybe they shouldn't. We barely believed it ourselves. When the secret was finally declassified, the public was astonished. Black and white images emerged. Men standing beside coiled reels, hoses vanishing into the surf, fueling lines stretching from island to continent. The newspapers called it the pipeline that beat Hitler, yet the men who built it said little. They knew that real victory often leaves no monument. Theirs had been a war of silence, fought not for glory but for endurance. The quiet conviction that the unseen mattered most, and in that silence, their legacy endured. The sea keeps its secrets. Today, if you walk the shores of the Isle of Wight and gaze out across the channel, you might still glimpse rusted coils half buried in sand, relics of a war that learned to move quietly. Beneath those waters lie the bones of Pluto, fragments of hose and steel that once pulsed with the rhythm of liberation. Time has softened them, but not their meaning. Wars are remembered for their thunder, for the roar of tanks, the scream of aircraft, the blinding flash of artillery. Yet the true victories are often whispered, measured not in noise but in persistence. Equations scribbled in fatigue, welds sealed by trembling hands, valves tightened against the cold. These too changed the world. The men of Pluto proved that courage is not always visible. Sometimes it hides beneath the waves, humming through the dark. The line they built was more than an engineering marvel. It was a promise that imagination could outmatch fear, that creativity could bend steel and strategy alike. From that moment forward, logistics ceased to be the dull machinery of war. It became its beating heart. Every modern supply line, every mobile command, every doctrine of endurance owes a quiet debt to those who dared to pump fuel through the sea. When NATO wrote its first operational blueprints, when the Cold War's lifeline stretched across continents, echoes of Pluto guided their logic: redundancy, resilience, invisibility. The principle remained the same. The best systems are the ones that work unseen. And so the camera drifts back to the channel, gray, endless, and calm. Beneath its surface, silence. But once that silence roared with purpose. The engineers who dreamed it are gone now. Their names footnotes in archives, their work buried under tides. Yet what they built endures not in pipes or pumps, but in the belief that the impossible can be engineered into reality. They built a lifeline that no enemy ever saw, and through it flowed not just fuel, but faith. Faith that ingenuity could defy the sea, that persistence could outlast fear, that the quiet hand of creation could turn the course of war,